Karen Pritchard stood in her perfectly manicured front yard at 6:47 a.m., coffee mug trembling in her white-knuckled grip, staring at the most egregious violation of Pinewood Estates community standards she had ever witnessed. A cement truck was backing into the Hendersons' driveway next door, its hydraulic whine drowning out the peaceful morning chorus of sprinklers and garbage disposal units that typically serenaded their upscale subdivision. "Excuse me!" she shrieked across the property line, her voice cutting through the diesel rumble like a fire alarm. "Excuse me!" The cement truck driver, a burly man with arms like tree trunks, leaned out his window. "Yeah, lady? Do you have a permit for that industrial vehicle?" He squinted at her, clearly trying to process why a woman in a powder blue terry cloth robe and matching slippers was interrogating him about permits. "I'm just delivering concrete, ma'am." To a residential neighborhood. Karen's voice climbed. "Another octave. This is a violation of Section 14.3b of our community covenants." The driver shrugged and continued backing up, which sent Karen into what her late husband Gerald used to call her full tornado mode. She stormed toward the truck, slippers slapping against the dewy pavement. "I am the president of the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association," she announced to no one in particular, though Mrs. Chen from across the street had emerged to water her roses and was now watching with undisguised interest. "And I will not allow this neighborhood to turn into some kind of construction zone, Bob." Henderson appeared from behind the cement truck, wearing work clothes that Karen immediately cataloged as inappropriate for suburban visibility hours. He had the audacity to wave at her. "Morning, Karen. Sorry about the early start, but the concrete guys could only fit us in." "What concrete guys?" Karen's eyes narrowed to laser-like points. "What exactly are you doing over there, Robert Henderson?" Bob's face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone about to share exciting news with a friend, which showed he had learned absolutely nothing about Karen in the 3 years they'd been neighbors. "We're putting in a swimming pool. Linda's been wanting one forever, and with the kids graduating." "A swimming pool?" Karen's mug hit the pavement with a ceramic crash that seemed to echo through the entire subdivision. Coffee splattered across her slippers, but she didn't even notice. "You're putting in a swimming pool without HOA approval?" "Well, we filed the paperwork last month." "I never approved any pool." Bob's smile faltered slightly. "The HOA board voted on it. It was unanimous." This statement hit Karen like a physical blow. She had been the HOA president for 7 years, ever since Gerald passed, and she needed something to channel her considerable organizational energies into. The idea that the board, her board, had made a major decision without her explicit approval was incomprehensible. "Which meeting?" she demanded. "The emergency meeting last Tuesday. We sent you 3 emails and called twice." Karen's mind raced. Last Tuesday, she had been at her sister's house in Phoenix, dealing with Diane's latest crisis involving a neighbor's dispute over a property line. She had specifically told the board secretary, that mousy Janet Williams, not to schedule anything important while she was gone. "Emergency meetings require 48-hour notice to all residents," Karen shot back, her voice gaining strength as she found her legal footing. "We gave 72-hour notice," Bob said patiently. "Karen, look, we followed all the rules. The pool meets all the setback requirements, it's not visible from the street, and it increases property values. Everyone wins. Everyone wins." The phrase hit Karen like fingernails on a chalkboard. In her experience, when everyone supposedly won, it usually meant Karen was losing. She surveyed the scene, the cement truck, now connecting its chute to begin. Pouring, Bob in his work clothes, looking annoyingly reasonable, the growing crowd of neighbors emerging from their houses to watch the spectacle. Mrs. Chen was no longer pretending to water her roses. The Kowalskis from 2 houses down had come out with their coffee mugs. Even the reclusive Mr. Park from the corner house was standing on his front porch, arms crossed watching. Karen realized she was standing in her bathrobe in the middle of the street, coffee-stained and wild-haired, looking like exactly the type of person she had spent years complaining about in HOA violation letters. The type of person who brought down property values and disturbed the peace. But as she looked around at her neighbors, in her subdivision that she had worked tirelessly to keep perfect, she made a decision that would change everything. "We'll see about that," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm that somehow seemed more threatening than her earlier shrieking. Bob's face fell. "Oh, come on, Karen, don't be like this." But Karen was already walking back toward her house with purpose, her terry cloth robe billowing behind her like a battle flag. She had phone calls to make. 20 minutes later, Karen sat at her kitchen table, now properly dressed in her power outfit, a navy blazer and khaki pants that screamed, "I speak to managers," with her reading glasses perched on her nose and her HOA binder open in front of her. The binder was 3 inches thick and divided into color-coded sections: community covenants, architectural guidelines, violation procedures, and her personal favorite, emergency enforcement protocols. She had already called Janet Williams, who had hemmed and hawed about the emergency meeting until Karen reminded her that failing to properly notify the HOA president of board meetings was grounds for removal. Janet had quickly produced the meeting minutes, which Karen was now studying with the intensity of a Supreme Court justice reviewing a landmark case. The paperwork appeared to be in order, which infuriated her. Pool specifications, setback measurements, drainage plans, even a landscape integration proposal. The Hendersons had clearly put thought into this, which made it worse somehow. Karen preferred dealing with obvious violations: unpainted fences, overgrown grass, unauthorized holiday decorations. In January, those were clear-cut. This pool situation was annoyingly complex. Her phone rang. "Karen?" It was Linda Henderson, Bob's wife. "I hope you're not upset about the pool." "I'm reviewing the documentation," Karen said crisply. "I know this might seem sudden, but we've been planning it for months. We even hired that landscape architect you recommended for the Patels last year." Karen paused. She had recommended Martin Quarry, and his work on the Patels' backyard had been, actually, quite nice. Professional, in keeping with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. "The board should have consulted me before approving such a major addition," Karen said, though her voice lacked its earlier fire. "Karen," Linda's voice was gentle, "you've done so much for this neighborhood. We all appreciate it. But you can't approve every single decision personally. That's why we have a board." The words stung because they contained an uncomfortable kernel of truth. Karen had, over the years, developed a reputation for thoroughness. Some might say micromanagement. Gerald used to joke that she ran the HOA like a military operation, which she had taken as a compliment. "I'll be monitoring the construction for code compliance," Karen said, which was as close to a concession as she was willing to make. "Of course. Thank you for understanding." After hanging up, Karen sat in her spotless kitchen, surrounded by the quiet hum of her energy-efficient appliances and the distant sound of concrete being poured. Through her window, she could see more neighbors gathering to watch the Henderson pool construction. People were talking, laughing, sharing coffee from thermoses. When was the last time she had been part of one of those casual neighborhood gatherings? When was the last time someone had invited her over for coffee or asked her opinion on something that wasn't HOA-related? The realization hit her with surprising force. She was lonely. Gerald had been gone for 3 years, and in that time, the HOA had become not just her responsibility, but her entire social world. Every interaction she had with her neighbors involved rules, violations, or procedures. She was the person they called when dogs barked too much or when someone painted their front door an unauthorized color. She wasn't someone they called to chat. But feeling sorry for herself wasn't going to solve anything. Karen Pritchard hadn't become the most effective HOA president in Pinewood Estates history by wallowing in self-pity. She had work to do. She picked up her phone and dialed the city planning office. Planning department, this is Marcus. This is Karen Pritchard from Pinewood Estates. I need to verify that a residential swimming pool construction project has all required city permits. What's the address? Karen provided Bob Henderson's address and waited while Marcus looked up the information. Yeah, we have permits on file. Pool construction, electrical, plumbing, all approved last month. Are you certain those permits comply with current residential construction codes? Ma'am, we don't issue permits that don't comply with codes, Karen felt her frustration building again. I'm specifically concerned about Section 47B regarding heavy machinery in residential areas. There was a pause. What kind of heavy machinery? Cement trucks, industrial vehicles disrupting the peace of our community at... Karen checked her watch. 7 in the morning. Another pause. Longer this time. Ma'am, cement trucks are standard for pool construction, as long as they're not violating noise ordinances. What are the noise ordinance? The next morning, Karen woke at 5:30 a.m., not because of cement trucks or construction noise, but because she had barely slept. Her mind had been racing with possibilities, plans, and the delicious anticipation of what she was about to unleash on Pinewood Estates. She made her coffee with unusual care, using the good china cup instead of her usual travel mug, and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, her phone, and a legal pad covered with notes she had scribbled throughout the night. The Henderson construction was already underway next door, the steady beep, beep, beep of backing machinery providing a rhythmic soundtrack to her plotting. But this morning the sound didn't irritate her. If anything, it served as inspiration. Martin Quarry had agreed to meet her at 9 a.m. to discuss her dramatic statement project. Before then, she had research to do. Karen had spent years learning the intricate details of every regulation, code, and covenant that governed their community. Now she was going to use that knowledge for something entirely different. She opened her laptop and navigated to the city planning website, specifically the section on residential construction permits. If Bob Henderson could build a swimming pool, there were certainly other things she could build, more interesting things. After an hour of research, Karen had compiled a list of structures that were technically permissible under both city codes and HOA guidelines. Gazebos, up to 200 square feet without special permits. Decorative water. Features, no size restrictions as long as they weren't classified as swimming pools. Storage buildings up to 120 square feet in rear yards. And, most intriguingly, decorative landscape architecture with no specific size limitations as long as it didn't violate setback requirements. The key word was decorative. According to the municipal code, decorative structures were evaluated differently than functional ones. They fell into a gray area that allowed for considerable creative interpretation. Karen's phone buzzed, a text from her sister Diane in Phoenix. How did the HOA meeting go? Did you shut down the pool? Instead of her usual detailed response, Karen typed back, change of plans, building something better. At exactly 9 a.m., Martin Quarry knocked on Karen's front door. She had worked with him on several neighbor projects, always in her capacity as HOA president, always focused on ensuring compliance with community standards. This was their first meeting as client and contractor. Martin was a tall, soft-spoken man in his 50s who specialized in what he called distinctive residential design. His portfolio included several projects that had won local landscaping awards, including the Patel's backyard transformation that Karen had referenced during her argument with Linda Henderson. Karen, he said, accepting the coffee she offered, I have to admit, your call last night surprised me. In all the time we've worked together, you've always been focused on maintaining standards rather than making statements. Karen settled. Across from him at her kitchen table, her notes spread between them. I've been thinking about that, about standards and statements and what it means to really make an impact in a community. She slid her legal pad across the table. Tell me what you think about this. Martin studied her sketches, his eyebrows rising progressively higher as He took in the scope of what she had outlined. This is ambitious. Is it possible? Technically, yes. But Karen, this isn't just ambitious. This is... He paused, clearly searching for the right word. This is going to get people's attention. Good. Martin set down the legal pad and leaned back in his chair. Walk me through your thinking here. Karen had been preparing for this question all morning. For 7 years, I've focused on making sure everyone in this neighborhood followed the same rules, maintained the same standards, contributed to the same overall aesthetic. I thought that was what community leadership meant. And now? Now I realize that real leadership means showing people what's possible. Instead of telling 46 other homeowners what they can't do, I want to show them what they can do. Martin picked up her sketches again, studying the details with professional interest. The engineering challenges alone. Are you saying it can't be done? I'm saying it's the most complex residential project I've ever been asked to design. The permits alone will take weeks, the construction will take months, and the cost... He paused to do quick mental calculations. We're talking about a 6-figure investment. Karen had already considered the financial implications. Gerald's life insurance, combined with her savings and the increase in her house value over the past 7 years, gave her options she had never seriously considered before. She wasn't wealthy, but she had enough to make choices based on something other than pure practicality. Cost isn't the primary concern, she said. Timeline is more important. How quickly can we get started? That depends on how quickly you can get permits approved. Martin grinned. Though I suspect you know more about navigating the approval process than most people. Karen grinned back. I might have some insights into the system. They spent the next 2 hours going through every detail of Karen's vision, with Martin making technical notes and suggesting modifications based on engineering requirements and permit limitations. By the time he left, they had transformed her late-night brainstorming into a legitimate construction proposal. The project would take approximately 4 months to complete, assuming no major permit delays. Construction would begin with excavation, lots of excavation, followed by specialized foundation work, then the installation of what Martin diplomatically referred to as water management systems. Karen walked him to the door, feeling energized in a way she hadn't experienced since Gerald's death. When can you have detailed plans ready? Give me a week for preliminary drawings, another week for engineering specifications. If you're serious about fast-tracking the permits, I can have everything submitted by the end of the month. After Martin left, Karen stood in her backyard, trying to visualize the transformation that was coming. Her current yard was exactly what HOA guidelines recommended: neat, symmetrical, and utterly forgettable. In 4 months, it would be something no one in Pinewood Estates or anywhere else would ever forget. Her phone rang. Janet Williams, the HOA secretary, sounded frazzled. Karen, we need to talk about last night's meeting. What about it? Well, several residents have called to complain about the emergency notice. They feel like it was misleading. Karen settled into one of her patio chairs, looking across the fence at the Henderson construction site where workers were now installing rebar for the pool foundation. Misleading how? They expected there to be an actual emergency. Instead, it was just about the Henderson's pool, which has already been approved. Janet, heavy construction machinery in a residential neighborhood at 7 a.m. constitutes an emergency by any reasonable standard. But Karen, it's just a swimming pool. People build pools all the time. Karen felt her jaw clench. Just a swimming pool. As if the standards and procedures she had spent years developing were meaningless. As if community oversight was some kind of optional hobby rather than essential neighborhood management. The issue wasn't the pool, Janet. The issue was the precedent. If we approve major construction projects without proper community input, we had proper community input. The board voted. 4 people voted, in a community of 47 homes. Karen, that's how the HOA works. We elect a board to make decisions. You wrote most of those procedures yourself. The reminder stung because it was true. Karen had, indeed, written most of the current HOA procedures back when she had trusted the board to make decisions that aligned with her vision for the community. She had never imagined they might make decisions she disagreed with. Well, Karen said carefully, perhaps it's time to revisit some of those procedures. There was a long pause on the other end. What do you mean? I mean that maybe the community would benefit from seeing what real leadership looks like. What happens when someone takes initiative instead of just managing problems? Karen, you're scaring me a little. Karen laughed, surprising them both. Don't be scared, Janet. Be excited. Things are about to get very interesting in Pinewood Estates. After hanging up, Karen spent the rest of the morning handling the mundane tasks that had consumed most of her time as HOA president, reviewing architectural change requests, responding to complaints about barking dogs and overgrown hedges, coordinating with the landscaping company that maintained the common areas. But now, instead of approaching each task as a critical component of neighborhood management, she found herself thinking about efficiency and delegation. How much of this work, actually, required her personal attention? How much could be handled by other board members or simple administrative procedures? By noon, she had identified at least 15 hours per week of HOA work that could be streamlined or eliminated entirely. 15 hours she would soon have available for more interesting projects. Her phone buzzed with a text from Bob Henderson. Karen, can we talk? I feel bad about how things went last night. Instead of her usual immediate response, Karen set the phone aside. Bob would have to wait. She had more important things to do than manage his guilt over a community meeting. She opened her laptop and began researching excavation contractors. Martin would handle the overall project management, but Karen wanted to understand. The excavator arrived like a mechanical dinosaur, its yellow bulk dwarfing every vehicle on Maple Street as it rumbled toward Karen's house on a flatbed trailer that took up the entire width of the road. Karen watched from her front window as the driver maneuvered the trailer into position, forcing the morning commuters to wait while the massive machine was unloaded. Mrs. Chen stood in her front yard, coffee mug in hand, staring at the excavator with an expression of pure disbelief. The Kowalskis had come out onto their porch, Tom shaking his head with the resigned look of a man watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. Even Mr. Park, who never acknowledged neighborhood activities, was standing at his window with his arms crossed. Karen felt a surge of satisfaction. If nothing else, her project was already accomplishing something the Henderson pool never had. It was getting everyone's attention. At exactly 7:15 a.m., her doorbell rang. She opened it to find Bob Henderson, still in his pajamas and robe, holding a travel mug and looking like he hadn't slept well. Karen, he said, that's the biggest excavator I've ever seen. Good morning, Bob. Coffee's fresh if you want some. He followed her into the kitchen, where she had set up a temporary command center with construction schedules, permit copies, and a detailed timeline that Martin had prepared. Through the window, they could see the excavator being positioned. In her backyard, its mechanical arm reaching toward the sky like a metal crane. How big is this project? Bob asked, studying the paperwork spread across her table. Significant. Karen, that machine could dig out a basement in a day. What exactly are you building back there? She handed him a cup of coffee and settled across. From him. Something the neighborhood will remember. That's what I'm afraid of. The excavator's engine roared to life, a deep diesel rumble that seemed to shake the entire house. Through the window, Karen could see the operator, a compact man named Rodriguez, who had impressed her with his detailed questions about the project specifications, beginning his first pass across her lawn. The bucket bit into the grass with mechanical precision, lifting away neat squares of sod that had taken her 3 years to establish. Karen felt a momentary pang of regret, watching her carefully maintained landscape disappear, but it was quickly replaced by anticipation for what would take its place. "Jesus," Bob muttered, watching the excavator work. "You're really doing this?" "I really am." Bob was quiet for several minutes, sipping his coffee and watching the destruction of Karen's backyard. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "You know, Linda thinks you're having some kind of breakdown." Karen looked at him sharply. "What do you think?" "I think you're pissed off about the pool vote. And this is your way of showing us what real construction disruption looks like." "And if it is?" Bob shrugged. "Then I guess we deserve it. We should have handled that whole situation better." The unexpected acknowledgement caught Karen off guard. She had been prepared for anger, complaints, even threats of legal action. She hadn't been prepared for Bob Henderson to take responsibility for the conflict that had started everything. "Bob, this isn't about punishment. What is it about?" Karen watched the excavator systematically removing the landscape she had spent years perfecting, preparing the ground for something entirely new. "It's about possibility." Possibility of what? Of building something that matters, instead of just maintaining something that's adequate. Bob nodded slowly. "I can understand that." By 9 a.m., a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk in front of Karen's house. The excavation work was visible from the street, and the noise was drawing neighbors from blocks away. Karen could see people, taking pictures with their phones, pointing at the growing pile of dirt in what used to be her backyard. Tom Kowalski knocked on her front door, his face grim. "Karen, we need to talk." She invited him in, though she could guess what the conversation would involve. Tom's expression had the look of someone delivering an ultimatum. "I've had 12 phone calls this morning," he said without preamble. 12. People want to know what you're doing, how long it's going to take, and why the HOA approved something this disruptive without community input. The HOA approved it because it meets all guidelines and requirements. You approved it. You signed your own architectural approval form, following the procedures we established. Tom sat down heavily in her living room chair, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past 3 weeks. "Karen, you have to know this is going to cause problems." "What kind of problems?" "People are talking about calling an emergency board meeting. Some are threatening to file complaints with the city. Maria is reviewing whether you have the authority to approve your own projects." Karen felt her stomach tighten. She had anticipated resistance, but not organized opposition. "The procedures are clear, Tom. As long as the project meets all requirements. The procedures assume that the HOA president will exercise reasonable judgment and consider community impact. They don't account for someone using their authority to wage personal vendettas." "This isn't a personal vendetta." "Then what is it?" Before Karen could answer, the excavator's engine noise changed pitch, becoming deeper and more strained. Through the window, they could see Rodriguez working on what appeared to be a particularly challenging section of the yard. "It's leadership," Karen said finally. "Real leadership. Not just managing problems, but creating something extraordinary." Tom was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Karen, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "Go ahead." "If this project fails, if it turns into a disaster that damages property values and destroys neighborhood relationships, will you take responsibility for that?" The question hit harder than Karen had expected. She had been so focused on the potential success of her project that she hadn't seriously considered the possibility of failure. What if the construction took longer than expected? What if the final result didn't match her vision? What if she had made a terrible mistake? "Yes," she said, though her voice carried less certainty than she intended. "If this turns out badly, I'll take responsibility." "Including stepping down as HOA president?" Karen stared at him. In 7 years, no one had ever suggested she might not be the right person for the job. The idea of giving up the position that had defined her identity since Gerald's death was almost incomprehensible. "If it comes to that," she said quietly. Tom nodded and stood up. "Then I guess we'll see what kind of leader you really are." After Tom left, Karen sat alone in her living room, listening to the excavator systematically tear apart her backyard, and wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The project that had seemed so clear and purposeful in her planning sessions with Martin now felt like a massive gamble with stakes she hadn't fully considered. But as she watched her neighbors gathering on the sidewalk, pointing and speculating about what she was building, she felt the same surge of determination that had started everything. For 7 years, she had been the person who managed problems and enforced rules. Now she was going to be the person who created something unprecedented. Whether it succeeded or failed, at least it would be memorable. The excavation continued for 3 days, each day bringing new crowds of observers and new levels of disruption to the neighborhood's routine. The pile of dirt in Karen's backyard grew to the size of a small hill, and the hole being excavated began to take on dimensions that shocked even Karen. On Wednesday afternoon, Martin arrived for a progress inspection and found Karen standing at the edge of what looked like an archaeological dig site. "This is bigger than I expected," he said, surveying the excavation. "Is that a problem?" "Not a problem, exactly. But the engineering requirements are going to be more complex than we originally planned. The foundation work alone will require specialized equipment." Karen looked down into the hole that had consumed most of her backyard. It was roughly circular, about 40 feet in diameter, and deep enough that Rodriguez had needed a ramp to drive the excavator in and out. "How specialized?" "We're going to need concrete pumping trucks, steel reinforcement, probably some pile driving for the deeper foundations." Martin paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "Karen, this is going to be louder and more disruptive than normal residential construction." "How much louder?" "Pile driving can be heard for blocks. We're talking about industrial-level noise that will go on for days." Karen felt a chill of apprehension. She had prepared for construction noise, but not for something that would affect the entire neighborhood. Her project was supposed to make a statement about vision and leadership, not turn her into the person who made everyone's life miserable. "Is there any way to minimize the noise?" "Some. We can use hydraulic piles instead of driven piles, which are quieter but more expensive. We can schedule the loudest work for midday hours when most people are at work. But Karen, there's no way to do this quietly." That evening, Karen sat at her kitchen table with a calculator, reviewing the cost estimates Martin had provided for the noise reduction modifications. The hydraulic piles would add $15,000 to the project cost. Scheduling restrictions would extend the timeline by 2 weeks. Other modifications would add another $8,000. She was looking at an additional $23,000 to make her project slightly less disruptive to her neighbors.